Hello and welcome back to Between the Hashes, our weekly college football primer, coming to you from Los Angeles, California with yet a different hairstyle. My name is Matt Keim, and welcome back, everybody, to Ampire Media, to Between the Hashes. And before we get any further into the show, remember, like, comment, subscribe if you like what you've been seeing here, either today or all season. Remember, every little bit helps. Give us a like, and come back to the channel for more updates on the Washington Commanders, fresh off of their victory over the Patriots, with the John Keim Report. You can find that on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Now let's get into the show. So we have another week of college football playoff rankings coming out. The first thing, I'll lead the show off with this. I am filming this particular episode on Wednesday of this week. I'm highlighting that because it is rumored that on Thursday, tomorrow, there will be more news about potential Big Ten discipline against Michigan head coach Jim Harbaugh and potential discipline against the university itself. As of today, there's still no notice of infractions or violations. The NCAA, the FBI, the Big Ten, they're all still investigating. There's some more wild rumors. Apparently, now Ohio State, Rutgers, and Purdue are being accused of sharing signals with each other, which technically, by rule of the law, isn't illegal NCAA terms, but depending on how they did it, might be against Big Ten regulations. It's a mess. So I'm not going to talk too much about Michigan, even though the headliner game does involve Michigan this week. I'm not going to talk too much about the scandal, just because by the time this video comes out, it's going to be pretty outdated. And so if you want me to comment on any discipline that might be coming down the pipeline this week, you're going to have to wait till next week. So with that out of the way, let's look at the rankings. The biggest change in the CFP committee rankings is, well, Oklahoma lost, by the way, called it, and they dropped out. Penn State shifted back up. The only real difference with my rankings last week was that I had Penn State in there instead of Ole Miss. Now they're both in there. My rankings, and here are my top 10. I'm just going to be doing what I did last week, where I just have them on display instead of doing a slow reveal. With my top 10, you're going to see a lot of similarities. I think the biggest difference is that I actually moved Texas up a couple spots to the number 6 spot, and just below all the unbeaten teams, over Oregon, over Alabama, Ole Miss, Penn State, etc. And the biggest reason I have for this is that I actually think it's starting to get to the point where Texas is super underrated. Sure, Kansas State might not be the Big 12 winners again this year, but they're still a solid team, and Texas beat them using a backup quarterback that struggled for a half. If you look at Texas's strength of schedule, if you look at, they've played the most opponents with a winning record. They have the best win by far out of anybody in the country over Alabama. And it's kind of getting to the point where I have unironically heard people making the arguments that if that final spot comes down to a potential, like, let's say 12-1 Alabama or a 12-1 Texas, well, it's Alabama, so they got to go. Well, no, Texas went into Tuscaloosa and beat them. Not only did they beat them, they won by 10. They won by double digits on the road in a game they controlled the line of scrimmage in. Sure, Alabama might be a much better team, and Jalen Milroe is a significantly improved quarterback than what we saw in that first month of the season. This is not the same Alabama team that struggled to put away South Florida. It's just not. They've gotten significantly better. They put away LSU. Granted, part of that was influenced by an injury to Jaden Daniels in the closing quarter. But the game was still, I think they were already up 14 by the time that happened. So I don't know how much of an impact the injury actually had on the game. With LSU falling to Alabama, unless Kentucky and I guess Auburn beat Alabama this month, then they're gonna go to Atlanta. And once again, quick reminder, my top 5 from last week is still the same. So it's going to be Georgia, Ohio State, Michigan, Washington, and then Florida State. The reason why I have Washington in there, and this is something I think Florida State's getting a little too much credit for. They're getting a little too much credit for beating an LSU team that has now lost to every good team they've played with the exception of Missouri. The more we see LSU as a complete body of work, the more of a seriously flawed team they become. And so many of these teams and their positions in these rankings are influenced by when and how they played at LSU. So Florida State, Alabama, Ole Miss, Missouri, all had key games against them. 3 of them won, 2 of them by double digits. I think we're getting to the point where we need to admit that LSU is a good but not great team. If that's the best win on your schedule, which is the case with Florida State, I don't think that's good enough to outweigh, say, a win against Oregon, which the committee has 6th. So I'm gonna keep Washington in there and Florida State at 5. I will give Florida State this. Their top 4 pass catchers have all been injured in the game against Pitt, which, it's Pitt. They're a 2-win team. Still not an easy thing to overcome. They've punched their tickets to the ACC title game. They're going to probably play Louisville unless Louisville stubs their toe in the next couple weeks. And so it's safe to say that Florida State actually probably has the inside track to the playoff. I also think it's a bit naive to assume that this top 6 is going to stay completely static. Something's going to happen. Ohio State and Michigan still have to play each other. Georgia and Alabama still have to play each other. Texas and probably Oklahoma State have to play each other, probably twice, or Texas and somebody. There's going to be at least a little bit of chaos because there always is. And so I'm not going to look at these initial rankings and then freak out, project hypotheticals that never come to fruition because it never works out that way. What I will say is that it's actually kind of disappointing that the 12-team playoff format is waiting until next year. So there you have it. That's the committee's ranking, my initial thoughts. I'm going to say that, once again, Georgia is starting to add to its resume. Missouri's a solid team. That was a solid win. Ohio State's resume, people are caterwauling about Ohio State not being the best team. The committee's going mainly by resume here, and the comparison between Ohio State, Michigan, and Georgia in those instances is not even close. And even at the end of the season, it still won't be close. But again, Ohio State and Michigan have to play each other, so let's pump the brakes on this just a little bit. With our talk of rankings out of the way, let's talk about the games. So, quick thing before I get into those games. The Ole Miss Georgia game, because of the importance of this game for both Georgia and Ole Miss and the rankings as a whole, I'm going to leave them out of the lightning round. We'll talk about them in a minute. Lightning round time. Now, there's a couple other ranked games this week, and I'm going to start with Utah going to Seattle to play Washington. I think Utah's a solid team. Nobody has been hit worse by the injury bug than they have this year. And so the fact that they've been able to stay ranked as far along as they have, stay relevant in the Pac-12, knocking off USC at the Coliseum, is nothing short of amazing. And Kyle Whittingham is one of the best coaches in the country. But because of these injuries and because of especially on the offensive side of the ball, and the super up and down quarterback play, there's a very definitive ceiling that they have, and that ceiling is once again going to get exposed this weekend. Washington is 9.5-point favorites. I think especially with Washington getting the groove back against USC, that's a more than fair line to bet. I think Washington wins this game and covers the spread. Next game, Tennessee goes and plays a very disappointed Missouri team. Tennessee is currently favored by 1, meaning this is a coin flip push 'em game as far as Vegas is concerned. Especially at home, I think I trust Missouri a little bit more here. Tennessee's offense has shown itself to be very, very inconsistent. Sure, they're blowing the doors off of bad teams, and they can even wake up against like an Alabama for a half, but it's just that collapse that they had is very, very hard to get out of my head. If it comes to a shootout, I think both Joe Milton and Brady Cook are very capable quarterbacks. I trust Brady Cook and the Missouri Tigers a little bit more at home here. Like I said, this is a coin flip game, so it could go either way. I'm going to take Missouri here to bounce back from a disappointing loss in which they hung in there the entire game against Georgia. So Missouri wins at home. Number 3, Miami goes on the road to take on Florida State. Okay, so I've talked a lot about Florida State, especially how they've been dealing with a lot of injuries, especially in the receiving core, and that's a challenge as a quarterback that had a hot start to the season, and Tyler Van Dyke comes to town. The thing to know about Miami is that since starting out, I think they started out 5-0. They have lost 3 of their last 4 games, one of which was because of one of the worst coaching blunders you can possibly ever see. And then the other 2, they were just kind of outplayed. And in the process of getting outplayed, their once hot quarterback with Tyler Van Dyke he's kind of fallen off a cliff a little bit. Can they get some momentum back? The thing with Miami is that they're actually capable of winning this game. They just don't have the consistency. And to be honest, I don't think there's a single position group where Miami has the strength over Florida State. I think this 14-point spread is more than fair. I like Florida State at home to win, cover, and to be honest, Florida State's not going to have a real challenger in the ACC until maybe Louisville in December. But even then, it's a little hard to see anybody really putting up a fight against this Florida State team. So I give Florida State the win and the cover here. All right, I'm going to exit my lightning round format to talk about Ole Miss and Georgia. I actually toyed with the idea of making this the headliner game. I didn't because I think the other one's a little bit more interesting. But here's what you need to know about the Ole Miss Georgia game. Ole Miss is currently almost an 11-point underdog. It's on the road. It's kind of amazing how the schedule worked out for Georgia, where all their big games are at home. But Georgia has gotten into the meat of their schedule where they're actually playing good ranked teams that are going to put up a fight. Missouri last week, Ole Miss this week, and Tennessee next week. I think Tennessee is the weakest of these three teams, but Ole Miss is the most interesting because there is a path to victory for Ole Miss here, and it's kind of the same path that, like, let's say Ohio State tried to take, where they can just bomb the hell out of you, and before you know it, they've scored 20 points, you know? But their line play is not nearly what, like, Ohio State's was. I don't know how much I trust Ole Miss on the line of scrimmage. That said, Georgia is dealing with some key injuries on the defensive side of the ball, so maybe there's a little bit of a neutralization that happens there. So I can see a scenario happening where Ole Miss comes out and scores a bunch of points. The problem is that I think that, especially with how well Carson Beck has been playing, these might be two of the top, 4 quarterbacks in the SEC right now, in Jackson Dart from Ole Miss and Carson Beck from Georgia. I can see a scenario where this turns into a shootout, but I think, especially at home, Georgia's talent is going to be a little too much for Ole Miss to handle. And this could very well be a game where Ole Miss pretty much has to play the perfect game. I trust them to do that in Oxford. I don't know that they're capable of doing this on the road. But here's a scenario. What happens if Ole Miss wins this weekend? Alabama still wins the West, but then loses to Georgia in the SEC title game. Which of those three teams goes to the playoff, if any? Food for thought. But going back to the immediate present game, I like Georgia to win, but I think Ole Miss will score enough points to where they're not going to get blown out. I think they cover. And that brings us to our true headliner game of the week. Michigan at Penn State, the first real test for Michigan. The first 9 games of the season for Michigan, and like I said earlier in the video, I'm not going to talk about the scandal in this section of the video, just the game. The first 9 games of the season have been a glorified preseason for Michigan. It's honestly stunning just how bad their schedule has been. Similar to Georgia. They have the 111th ranked strength of schedule. They have the first overall remaining strength of schedule, but even when you factor the Penn State and Ohio State games into their schedule, they're still like 89th strength of schedule. It's abysmal. Their schedule is so bad that Rutgers is their best win, and not only is that their best win, it's only one of 2 teams that they've played that are bowl eligible currently. The other one is UNLV. Which, by the way, that's a nice story. UNLV has not been bowl eligible in a long while, but let's not give Michigan credit for an out-of-conference win there. This is not to say that Michigan's a bad team. I certainly don't think that. What I do think is that they haven't been tested at all. It's why I think the line's only 4.5 right now, which, given how dominant people view Michigan and how pretty much everybody sold their stocks on Penn State following that Ohio State loss, it's interesting to me that this line is as small as it is. The other thing with this matchup is that it's the 2 top overall defenses in the country playing against each other. Michigan is first, giving up something like 24 yards per play, while Penn State is second while giving up 4 yards per play. These are both very, very sound, very, very strong defenses. So it wouldn't shock me, for example, if this game turned out to be a little bit like the Ohio State-Penn State game, at least for a half, where the defenses are just kind of bashing at each other. Especially because Michigan's style this year, and you see this against the Rutgers game, and hell, it happened against Bowling Green where they had a shaky start, where they're more focused on establishing control of the game as opposed to just trying to bomb or air raid the hell out of you or bomb it down the field. Michigan currently boasts the individual leader in rushing touchdowns with Blake Corum, remember him? J.J. McCarthy has evolved into a Heisman candidate. So speaking of J.J. McCarthy, for those of you that have been following Michigan the past couple years, one of the key things to know about the past couple of teams is that 2 different quarterbacks actually have taken them to the playoffs. Cade McNamara 2 years ago and J.J. McCarthy last year. The 2 of them had been on the team for about the same length of time. One was seen as a much more solid pocket passer, while the other was seen as like this athletic running around, but not nearly as strong of a passer, had a weaker deep ball. And so when Michigan made the flip from McNamara to McCarthy last year, one of the questions everybody had was to see if McCarthy could push the ball down the field well enough to keep up with an Ohio State or a Georgia or an Alabama or, in last year's case, a TCU. And he actually turned out, especially in those last 3 games that Michigan played last year, he turned out pretty well. Now, his problem was that, especially in the TCU game, he had a huge turnover problem. The turnovers have actually been reduced, and his yards per attempt have gone up. So he's averaging something like 10.89 yards per attempt, which, for way of comparison, as it relates to this game, Drew Aller on the other sideline, he's averaging something like 6.9 yards per attempt. So there's a pretty substantial difference between the two. And it's one of those stats that just goes to show how much he's grown as a quarterback instead of just being an athlete that happens to catch the snaps. But once again, this is going to be their most significant test all year. And one of the reasons why I think a lot of people, myself, to be fair, included, are giving Michigan such benefit of the doubt is that for the most part, it's a lot of the same guys who went to the playoffs both 2 years ago and last year. A lot of these guys are still hanging around. And so this is a very, very experienced roster. So even though they haven't played it in those games this year, they've played in them in the past. So it's, that said, there's still nothing like getting punched in the mouth once a year, you know? And so if you just take this by position group, the defenses are just about dead even. Will the J.J. McCarthy from last year, the one that struggled against good defense, will he show up? One thing to note is that when they beat Rutgers is actually not a bad team. They have something like a top 20 rated defense. And so we can look at that performance to see what's going on. And Michigan had a hard time, at least in the first half, pulled away in the second half. And that's kind of been their style the whole time. So I can kind of see that happening this year, where Michigan really struggle, especially because it's in Happy Valley, where Michigan struggles for a half. But I just think when it comes down to it, especially because we've seen Penn State and James Franklin in so many of these types of games, and it kind of always plays out in a similar way, at least where, like, say, Ohio State is concerned, where the other team is just able to make 1 or 2 more plays. And so I think J.J. McCarthy is capable of making those 1 or 2 more plays to take Michigan over the top. So I'm going to say Michigan wins, and they cover. All they have to do is win by a touchdown. I think they're more than capable of doing that. And then we will learn a lot more about both Penn State and Michigan following this game. And that's all I have for you guys this week. Thanks for sticking around. Remember to give us a like, comment, subscribe, follow Ampire Media on YouTube for more updates with Between the Hashes or the John Keim Report. With the latter show, you can watch here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, guys, and enjoy the games.